I grew up in a two-story suburban house, with a neatly trimmed lawn and a driveway that could fit 3 cars at once. I always felt there was something artificial in the air inside our home, as if every gesture of affection, every smile, was designed for display. My parents were so overwhelmingly proud of my older brother. He was the star athlete, the kid with top grades, the one teachers adored. They told me to be more like him, always reminding me how lucky I was to have an example to emulate. Whenever I tried to express myself, saying I wanted to join the drama club or learn painting, they shook their heads with a certain polite disappointment. "That's not practical," my father would mutter, as he pored over my brother's soccer trophies, polishing them until they gleamed. It was in small moments like that, watching him handle those statues, that I realized I didn't matter in the same way. I wasn't the chosen child. If my brother was the reason for their bragging rights, I was just the reason they had a spare bedroom set up in case he needed it for guests. Sometimes, I caught them half glancing at me when they thought I wasn't looking, as if I were a mistake that needed to stay out of sight. I remember once, in my early teens, I came home from a junior art competition. I'd won 2nd place, my first recognition. I clutched that certificate in my sweaty hands, bursting with excitement. Maybe this small victory could bridge the gaping hole between me and my parents' approval. But the moment I stepped inside, my brother announced he'd been scouted by some fancy soccer club. My father actually lifted him off the ground in a congratulatory bear hug. My mother's eyes glowed with pride. And me? My certificate was practically invisible. They didn't bother to ask where I'd been or notice I was wearing paint-stained clothes. Everything melted into the background whenever my brother was around. I let the certificate slip onto the kitchen counter, trying to swallow the bitter taste in my throat. My father shot me a quick glance, gave me a limp pat on the shoulder, and said, "Don't worry, you'll find your calling someday." I almost laughed at how casually he disregarded the literal proof of my passion I was holding. Time passed, and that pattern continued. My brother's successes piled up, scholarships, accolades, a growing network of important connections. My parents beamed at every mention of his name. Meanwhile, I moved through life in partial anonymity, quietly picking up the slack when something at home needed fixing, consoling my mother when she was upset about a minor argument with my father, or running errands because my brother was too busy to bother. If I complained, they brushed it aside. "Your brother has bigger things on his plate." I learned to clench my jaw and silently endure it, even as frustration hammered inside my chest. They never wanted me to surpass him, they only needed me in case he stumbled. Deep down, I sensed it. I was the backup child, the plan B if the golden son ever failed. It wasn't that they wanted me to be him, they just wanted me to serve as a safeguard for his future, to fill whatever gaps he left behind. My feelings were an afterthought, and I tried to suppress the resentment growing in my gut. After high school, I managed to get into an arts program at a modest college. I was ecstatic. This was my chance to shape my identity, far from my parents' shadow. But I soon discovered that my college savings, a fund I believed they'd started when I was a baby, had been mostly spent on my brother's private training camps. I can still recall the tremble in my hands when I saw the account statement. The balance was so low it wouldn't cover half a semester. I confronted my father, heart pounding so fiercely it felt like my ribs might crack. He just shrugged. "Your brother had better opportunities. We couldn't let them slip by," he said. Then my mother chimed in, "We thought you could just take out a loan if you really wanted college." The casual brutality of their logic, my future sacrificed for his convenience, left me speechless. My body tensed so hard I thought I'd shatter my own teeth from clenching. That was the first time I truly recognized their priorities. They never intended to nurture my ambitions. They were only concerned with fueling my brother's relentless ascent. I did take out loans, working part-time in a cramped diner downtown. My boss was always stressed, snapping at us for the tiniest mishaps, and I often came home with grease stains on my pants. Yet that job became a twisted blessing. It taught me self-reliance in a way I'd never known before. Every time my feet ached from the long shifts, I'd push forward, fueled by an ever-expanding fury. My rage was like an engine driving me toward success, even though I dreaded the debt I was piling up. My parents sent me perfunctory messages now and then, usually updates about how my brother was doing. He was thriving, apparently, new sports endorsements, corporate networking events, a fancy internship. I'd read their texts and then stare at my phone, feeling a mixture of raw hurt and fierce determination. Fine, I'd think. Let him have the spotlight. I'll build my own path, no matter how humble it may be. By the time I graduated with a degree in art and design, my brother was climbing the corporate ladder at a real estate firm. My parents bragged about him at every opportunity, as if reciting a litany of reasons why I'd never measure up. I visited home less and less, unable to stomach the lopsided dynamic. Yet ironically, whenever they needed help, like organizing a family function or caring for my aging grandfather, they called me. Your brother's schedule is so hectic, they'd say, piling responsibilities on my shoulders. I felt the heat rising up my neck each time, wanting to scream. But I always kept a calm tone, telling myself I was being the bigger person, that I wouldn't stoop to pettiness. Each time I complied, though, something in me chipped away. My parents had me pegged as the sacrificial child who'd do the dirty work, while they saved their cheers and admiration for my brother. Life carried on that way for years. I eventually started my own small design business, focusing on branding for local entrepreneurs. It was a grind, but I poured every ounce of will into it. My client list slowly grew, my skill set expanded, and for once, I felt proud of something that was entirely mine. Meanwhile, my parents rarely asked about my work. Occasionally they'd say, "That's cute," when they learned I'd gained a new client. But mostly they'd pivot to another praise-laden anecdote about my brother's new accomplishments. I'd smile through tight lips, wrapping my arms around myself to keep from lashing out. I told myself their approval didn't matter. Yet late at night, I'd lay awake staring at the ceiling, my pulse racing with bitterness. Part of me yearned for them to just once acknowledge me with the same delight they reserved for him. One day, I got a call from my mother. Her voice was shaky. My father had fallen in the yard and broken a hip. In an instant, the complicated swirl of emotions I had for them was overshadowed by genuine concern. I rushed to their home, where I found them in an anxious state. My father was in pain, complaining about how the hospital staff wasn't treating him like a priority. My mother was on the verge of tears. My brother was apparently away, traveling for some crucial business meeting. She clutched my hand, her fingers trembling, and begged me to stay. I pushed aside the resentment that threatened to surge and nodded. For the next few weeks, I practically moved in, driving them to appointments, cooking meals, making sure prescriptions were filled. My father's mood swings flared. Sometimes he'd snap at me, complaining that the food wasn't hot enough, or that I took too long in the pharmacy line. In these moments, he'd mutter about my brother, how he would have handled it better if he were here. My nails bit into my palms, but I forced a neutral expression. I told myself to endure, once again, because part of me still felt responsible for my parents, no matter how unfairly they treated me. When my father finally stabilized, I decided to stick around a bit longer. They were still frail, and in a strange twist, I felt obligated to help. One afternoon, sorting through documents in the study, I stumbled upon an old will and an accompanying trust agreement. My brother's name was everywhere. He was set to inherit not just a share, but practically all the major assets, our childhood home, a sizable portfolio of stocks, even a vacation property I didn't know we had. Meanwhile, my name was attached to a trivial bank account. It was heartbreakingly obvious. My parents had set me aside like a loose thread, That realization struck me like a punch in the gut. My chest grew tight, and I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Instead, I inhaled a shaky breath and carefully replaced the documents. My father hobbled in on his cane, curious about what I was doing. He saw the papers in my hand, and a shadow passed over his face. He didn't bother to deny it. "We always had to ensure your brother's future," he said, leaning heavily on the cane. You're more independent. You could figure things out on your own." His voice was oddly calm, as if I should appreciate the compliment. My mother appeared behind him, arms folded like a protective shield. I wasn't sure if she was guarding him or supporting his stance. My heart pounded so loudly it threatened to deafen me. Their justification was that I didn't need the security net, as if I hadn't spent my whole life working twice as hard with half the support. All my old anger came rushing back. I managed to speak, voice shaking slightly. "What if your precious son doesn't use any of this for you when you're older, or if you need more care?" My father's eyes hardened. "He will," he said curtly, as if doubt was inconceivable. My fists clenched at my sides, nails biting into my palms, and I walked out before I said something I'd regret. A few days later, my brother finally returned from his trip. He waltzed into the house, head high with that practiced smugness. He looked me up and down and muttered, "Oh, you're still here," as if my presence was mildly irritating. Our parents showered him with relief and warmth, praising him for showing up, never mind that I'd been there for weeks doing the heavy lifting. He soaked it in, then feigned a moment of sympathy, patting my shoulder. The look in his eyes was pity, like I was some poor, aimless creature cluttering up his rightful domain. I felt my chest tighten again, but I took a slow breath and forced a polite nod. He had no idea I'd seen the inheritance plans. He had no clue just how little regard our parents had for me beyond my use as a caretaker. So I bided my time, silently observing how he would help around the house in the most superficial ways, buying them groceries once or twice, taking a few photos with my father for social media. Then, after a week, he declared he had pressing work obligations and left again. Watching him walk out so easily, knowing the entire estate was practically deeded to him, I was done. Something inside me snapped into focus. I realized my parents' favoritism had carved my self-worth into pieces, made me constantly question if I was enough. But in that flash of clarity, I knew I wanted to fight for my share, not out of greed, but for the principle that I wasn't disposable. As I helped my mother with the dishes that night, she spoke in a measured, almost rehearsed tone about how they were all set for the future. "Your brother might eventually move us closer to him," she said. "He'll have the resources for a better facility if your father's health continues to decline." I forced a brittle smile, even as my jaw tensed. My father shuffled into the kitchen, and I observed how fragile he looked, leaning on his cane. Despite his vulnerability, he never softened enough to apologize for how they'd treated me. And so, I quietly made the decision. I was taking back what was mine, or at least fighting for it, even if it meant going against all of them. I found a lawyer recommended by a friend, someone specializing in estate disputes. When I explained the entire situation, from the lopsided will to the intangible years of neglect, she was cautious. "Wills are powerful legal instruments," she said as she scrolled through some notes. "You'd have to prove some sort of undue influence, or argue that the documents don't reflect your parents' real intent. And if everything's been set up for years, it's going to be an uphill battle." She didn't sugarcoat it. The courts usually respect what's written in a properly executed will. But I had to try. I'd never felt such an intense resolve. My chest felt both heavy and oddly liberated at the thought of challenging my parents' plan. She began investigating the trust structure. It turned out that some assets had been transferred to my brother's name years ago. He was effectively the manager of certain family properties. We discovered suspicious paperwork suggesting my brother had manipulated a few legal documents. My father's signature appeared on pages authorizing my brother to sell or rent out real estate. The more we dug, the more signs of potential coercion, or at least shady maneuvering, emerged. My lawyer's expression grew grimmer by the day. "If this is what I think it is, your brother has been consolidating control for a while," she said. "He might have convinced your parents he's just organizing their finances, but it looks more like a power grab." Energized by these findings, I confronted my parents, my heart hammering against my ribcage. They reacted with affront, as if I was accusing them of wrongdoing. My father's grip on his cane tightened, and my mother's eyes flared with indignation. "How dare you imply your brother is stealing from us? He's helping manage everything," she snapped. I felt a flush crawl up my neck, but I stood my ground, explaining that the documents indicated something else. My father eventually fell silent, his gaze drifting to the floor. Perhaps a part of him realized the implications. My mother, though, refused to budge, claiming I was just jealous. My entire body shook as I tried to contain my anger. Their stubborn denial stung worse than I expected. My lawyer and I decided on a multi-pronged approach. We'd gather evidence of any questionable transfers, plus any communications hinting that my brother manipulated them. But the biggest hurdle was time. My brother moved swiftly, always a step ahead. He had financial backing, a network of attorneys ready to crush any lawsuit. My small legal team was outmatched, but we had sincerity on our side. I also poured my personal savings into this, scrounging every spare penny I had. The rest, I financed with help from a friend. The stress mounted, making my hands tremble whenever I tried to work on design projects. But I channeled my frustration into stubborn determination. I wasn't going to let him corner me again. I'd grown up in his shadow for too long. In the midst of these proceedings, a baffling twist emerged. My brother publicly announced a new business venture involving our childhood home. He was turning it into a wellness retreat, of all things, claiming that it was what our parents wanted. I nearly dropped my phone when I saw the press release. My father had only just recovered from surgery. There was no way he'd want strangers parading around his house in yoga pants, but my brother apparently had the paperwork to support that plan. The arrogance took my breath away. He'd already begun construction changes, installing some fancy amenities in the backyard, painting over my parents' room. Furious, I rushed to the house, half hoping my parents would be outraged. Instead, my mother said, in a subdued tone, that maybe it would help with finances. She tried to justify that my father's bills were high, and they needed the money. My father just stared blankly when I demanded to know if he authorized this. With a quiet slump in his posture, he said, "Your brother knows best." I wanted to scream, to grab and shake him out of that blind devotion. Instead, I stepped outside to collect myself. The sun glared on the driveway, intensifying the tightness in my chest. This was the moment I realized my brother's cunning extended far beyond what I had grasped. He had exploited my father's frailty, sweet-talking him with promises of comfortable living and future stability. Now, the property that housed my childhood memories was on track to become some glossy retreat for wealthy guests. That was when the idea of a negotiated settlement flew out the window. I promised myself I would fight him in court if I had to. My lawyer filed a formal objection, requesting a temporary injunction to halt any modifications to the property until we could sort out ownership. It wasn't simple. We had to argue that I, as a beneficiary, had standing to challenge the sale or repurposing of the house. My brother responded with a team of slick attorneys who downplayed my claims. They filed motions to dismiss, calling me a disgruntled sibling who was simply bitter. Their documents dripped with condescension. But a judge granted a preliminary hearing to consider the injunction. That small victory made my heart pound with nervous anticipation. Even so, I could see the cracks forming around me. My bank account sank closer to zero with each passing day. My design business was neglected because all my energy was poured into the legal battle. Still, I told myself it was worth it to finally stand up for my place in the family. On the day of the hearing, I dressed in a conservative outfit, my palms sweaty against the smooth fabric of my blazer. My brother arrived with a confident swagger, flanked by his lawyers in impeccable suits. My parents trailed behind him, looking drained. I caught my mother glaring in my direction, and my father refused to meet my eyes. My chest tightened, but I swallowed hard and entered the courtroom. My lawyer presented our evidence, the suspicious transfer forms, the timeline of my brother's assumption of control, the mismatch between what my parents supposedly authorized and what they themselves had verbally expressed years ago. My brother's legal team countered by painting me as irresponsible, trying to sabotage the family's finances out of petty jealousy. At one point, my lawyer asked for a freeze on certain accounts pending a deeper investigation. My brother's attorneys scoffed, as though it was laughable that I'd even attempt such a move. The judge asked pointed questions about my father's competency at the time these documents were signed, noticing that the signatures were barely legible on some forms. The tension in the room was thick as heavy curtains. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, beads of sweat forming on his brow. My brother clenched his jaw so tight I wondered if he might crack a tooth. It was the first time I'd seen him truly rattled. Then, shockingly, the judge granted a limited freeze on any sale or large-scale renovation, pending further review. I exhaled in relief, shoulders trembling from the emotional weight of it all. But as we emerged from the courthouse, my brother cornered me. He hissed under his breath that I was making a mistake, that I'd never win a full case because the will clearly favored him. His eyes burned with malice. Suddenly, he pulled out a piece of paper from an inner pocket. It was some new contract. He claimed my parents had transferred even more assets to him in the previous week. I stared at the signature line. If it was my father's penmanship, it was scrawled and shaky. My stomach twisted. Was my father even fully aware of what he'd signed? My brother's grin was smug. "Keep fighting me, and I'll make sure you regret it," he muttered. My entire body tensed, adrenaline surging. But I just turned on my heel and walked away, refusing to let him see how shaken I was. Over the next few weeks, the legal morass deepened. My lawyer warned that proving undue influence was notoriously difficult. My father, whether coerced or not, might say under oath that he understood the documents. And if my mother backed him up, it'd be my word against theirs. My nights were sleepless, haunted by the possibility I might lose everything, validating my parents' assumption that I was just a backup child, never meant to inherit anything real or lasting. Sometimes, my hands shook so uncontrollably I could barely hold a pencil to sketch out design concepts for my dwindling client base. I teetered on the brink of giving up, but something in me refused to back down. If I quit, I'd forever remain the child who accepted scraps while my brother got the feast. Suddenly, a strange development occurred. My father decided to change lawyers. He'd apparently gotten into a heated argument with my brother behind closed doors. My mother confessed to me, late one night, that my father felt cornered. She claimed he never intended for my brother to unilaterally take the house and rename it a retreat center, that he was just trying to streamline finances. My father, she said, felt betrayed. This news landed like a jolt of electricity in my system. Maybe there was a chance, I thought, that he would stand up to my brother and declare my right to an equal portion. My mother's eyes were red-rimmed as she admitted this, but still she wouldn't openly say I deserved more. She ended our conversation by whispering, "Your father is confused. Just give him time." Yet time was exactly what my brother's side used to keep pushing through more legal obstacles. Finally, a second hearing arrived, more pivotal than the first. By then, I'd discovered something that might change everything. a hidden clause in one of the original trust documents that specified if there was any evidence of manipulation by a trustee, my brother, in this case, the trust would revert to equal distribution among all direct heirs. My lawyer was astounded I'd found it. I'd spent nights sifting through dusty boxes in the attic, scanning old legal paperwork, flipping through thousands of pages. It was right there, typed in small print, something my brother had apparently overlooked. Hope flickered in my chest. We marched into court armed with this hidden clause, ready to argue that his relentless self-dealing triggered the reversion. My brother and his attorneys balked, accusing me of forging or misrepresenting the documents. But the authenticity was confirmed by the date stamps and official seals. The turning point came when my father, looking fragile but resolute, took the stand. He confessed that he'd indeed felt pressured by my brother, that he hadn't realized the extent of the transfers he was signing. He'd been led to believe these documents were just simplifying paperwork. A hush fell over the courtroom, broken only by the scribbling of the stenographer's keys. My brother's face drained of color, and for a second, I thought he might lunge at my father. He sank back in his seat, fists clenched. My mother was weeping silently, hands pressed together. In that moment, a swirl of conflicting emotions tore through me, anger, relief, sorrow that it had come to this. My father's confession validated all my suspicions, but at the same time, it shattered the last remnants of the family facade. My brother's lawyers scrambled to contain the damage, questioning my father's competency, insinuating he was too old and confused to recall events accurately. But the judge seemed less inclined to believe that story after seeing how coherently he testified. Days later, the ruling was in, the trust distribution was to be halted and reassessed. My brother's manipulations created enough doubt that the court froze further transactions until a thorough audit could be completed. The house renovations were halted. The so-called wellness retreat plan was put on indefinite pause. My parents, in the midst of this legal chaos, were left with the humiliating realization that their golden son had crossed lines they never imagined. Meanwhile, I regained a chance for an equitable share. Sitting in the courthouse hallway after the judge's decision, I felt the tension drain from my muscles, replaced by sheer exhaustion. I wasn't jubilant in the way I'd imagined. Instead, I felt weighed down by the gravity of what our family had become. But I also sensed a new seed of self-respect taking root in me. In the weeks that followed, we navigated the painstaking complexities of unraveling the trust. Accountants combed through decades of transactions. My father was deposed multiple times, my mother gave statement after statement, and my brother's legal team tried every trick to stall, hoping I'd run out of resources. But I held on. My lawyer submitted the hidden clause as the foundation for a reformed estate plan, which, if approved by the court, would ensure I received an inheritance more reflective of an equal share. It wasn't certain yet. There was talk of a settlement, negotiations about percentages, continued medical evaluations of my father's capacity. Some days, I felt like I was drowning in paperwork and court motions. Yet I pushed on. For the first time, I saw my father muster enough humility to say, "I'm sorry we put you through this." He spoke those words in a frail voice, avoiding direct eye contact, but it still made my throat tighten with emotion. My mother hovered at his side, finally acknowledging my worth in quiet, broken sentences. I had no illusions that we'd become a perfect family, but at least they recognized the damage their favoritism had wrought. The final negotiation was tense. My brother, exhausted, though still defiant, agreed to cede control of certain assets to a neutral third party while the reallocation proceeded. He shot me venomous glances across the table, but I refused to shrink under his gaze. I could almost taste his resentment, as he realized he was no longer invincible. By the end of that session, we had a framework. The estate would be split more fairly, with legal safeguards so that no single child could manipulate my parents in their later years. As we left the conference room, I felt a momentary surge of triumph, remembering how many times they'd told me I was secondary, an afterthought. But victory was tempered by sadness at the irreversible damage done to our family bonds. In the months since, I've focused on rebuilding my design business. I still sometimes shake when I recall how close I came to losing everything. Though the settlement left me with financial stability, it's not about money anymore. It's about that sense of worth I found in the fight. I think my parents finally realized I was more than a placeholder. At least, on the evenings when I visit them now, there's a softer tone to my father's voice when he asks how my projects are going. My mother no longer fixates solely on my brother's achievements. Sometimes, we talk awkwardly about the past, about how things might have been different if they'd encouraged my art when I was young. We tread carefully, both sides knowing some wounds can't be fully erased. My brother remains distant, seething over his perceived betrayal. We rarely speak beyond obligatory holiday gatherings. It still hurts, seeing how resentful he is, but I'm learning to let go of the need for his approval. Standing up for myself was the hardest thing I've ever done, and ironically, it's given me the confidence I always craved. I might never have the cozy family dynamic I once fantasized about, but I've reclaimed my identity from the role of a backup child. Looking back on the turmoil, I realize I never just wanted money or property. I wanted acknowledgement that I wasn't worthless, that my life mattered as much as my brother's. And in the end, maybe that's the real inheritance, the knowledge that I decided my own value, rather than letting them define it for me. Now, I'm learning to forgive, though that doesn't mean forgetting. Sometimes, an echo of old anger lingers when I see how easily my parents still slip into praising my brother for trivial things. But I remind myself how far I've come, how I now hold my head high without seeking their applause. Everything changed the day I stood up in court, trembling but unyielding, to assert that I deserved better. That moment remains etched in my memory like a permanent line in the sand. Despite the heartbreak, the bruised feelings, and the fractured family ties, I finally found my voice. And with that voice, I fought for what was mine, and discovered I had been worth fighting for all along.